Welcome to our third writing webinar this semester. My name is Professor Volker Janssen, and I'm hosting this as part of the campus-wide effort to improve our sense of coherence and sense of community with graduate students in non-supervised courses, meaning courses where you need to complete writing projects, whether that be an oral history project, a public history project, a thesis, or an exam. For those of you who have paid attention to this in the past, we had a meeting with two alumni who talked with passion and lots of good advice about their writing experiences. Last month, we spoke with Professor Neufeld about writing, and this month, with one delay and scheduling error on my part, we are speaking with Professor Jochen Burgtorf, the founder of the German diaspora, German academic diaspora in the Department of History. Not all Germans are bearded and bald, even though in this session they are. This is not by design, and this is how we met. So I'm going to admit a few more people that are in the waiting room, and the waiting room being an innovation that I introduced to make sure that we don't get bombed by Zoom bullies. And I want to now introduce you to Jochen Burgtorf, who's here with a video camera and a picture. The reason that I'm here only with a picture is not because I'm coy, but because my desktop at home doesn't actually have a webcam, and by the time I realized I should order one, it was way too late. So now, if you want to order a webcam online, it only arrives around the end of May, so it will be too late for that. So I'm going to let someone else speak now and turn to Professor Burgtorf. For those of you who will be surprised to hear this, I'm calling him Jochen or Joe, Jochen being the German, and that's because, well, we've known each other now for 15 years. So, Joe, I want to begin with asking you about sort of your origins as a writer. What motivates you, or what originally motivated you to commit yourself to writing?
It's interesting because when you sent me the questions, I've always liked writing, and maybe that's because I've always liked reading. I started reading before I was in elementary school, and so I've always had this fascination with script. I also love languages. Is the sound okay? I just want to make sure that...
Perfect.
Okay, good. And even in high school, I remember that it didn't even really matter to me what the topic was about. I loved the challenge of researching just about anything and organizing material and going to libraries and all that. And I remember that one of the biggest challenges that was ever thrown my way was when I was a first semester freshman, and I had to answer, as one of the homeworks, I had to answer 4 questions about a document, and it was a historical document, and we only had a half page per answer. And I thought that was incredibly difficult. And those were the days when computers were just coming up. And so I figured, well, there are no stipulations about font size or spacing or anything like that. So I basically just said, how much can I squeeze into a half page on a piece of paper? And the professor had a good laugh, because he said, well, you adhere to the letter of the law, but not to the spirit of the law, because you wrote about 4 times what you expected. But I've always really enjoyed even the agony of the creative process, because it is so gratifying when it's finally done. You know, so it's almost like you put yourself through the ringer, but there's something at the end that is worth looking forward to.
Did you never go through a period where the labor of writing, the work, somehow deterred you?
Probably not so much, because I have a process, and I think that's one of the questions that's coming up about the actual writing process. I write very late in the game, so I do a lot of I have a research process that I think we'll talk about, that basically puts the writing, the actual polished writing, almost at the very end of the process. But you know, honestly, right now in this COVID-19 period, I have found that my writing has slowed down considerably. And I think it's one of those challenges that we face, that we just have to manage expectations. We have to say, all right, so maybe usually I'm accustomed to writing so many pages per day or so many paragraphs per day. And right now it is just, for whatever reasons, it is just going more slowly. Mm-hmm. But I think the greatest advice that I was ever given and that I can give is to just basically try to write a little bit every day and manage expectations. And then even when you think that you have hit a writer's block or something, which can happen, just kind of stick to your schedule. Just basically say, I'm just gonna, let's say I have set aside 2 hours. I'm just gonna fill those 2 hours, because it's amazing. Sometimes we get sort of this adrenaline rush, like right before the end, and then I just cut myself off. But it's never been that I've actually said, no, I can't write right now. Because I've always liked it so much.
If you're anything like me, you may still remember some of your high school experiences. And I recall that even though I did the equivalent of a major in history in Germany, it was actually my worst subject. Yes, next to English. So here I am. And I recall the one central feedback I got from my history instructor, who really despaired over me, is that I never answered the question. And that the major problem in my writing was that I failed to respond to what people wanted to know from me. And I wonder whether you recall any sort of telling feedback that you got early on in your writing that still sticks with you as a reminder of what not to do in writing.
Yeah, I do recall several feedbacks. One was actually fairly early on in high school, because I was actually, for reasons I know why. I was not a really good speller, because I was reading so many really old books where the spelling was still very much 19th century, and where people were using double S's instead of the sharp S and all these things. And so I was just emulating whatever spelling I was most accustomed to at the time. And so I remember getting one of those spelling tests back where I did horribly, and the teacher was like, I don't understand what the problem is. And then I remember getting a paper back one time where, and I did take that to heart, where the teacher actually said, your language here is incredibly pretentious. I mean, basically, whenever you can use a plain German word, you're trying to use one of those anglicized German words. And he said, why are you doing this? Because you are basically obstructing clarity. You are not making yourself clear. People have to reread your sentences twice, and they shouldn't have to do that. And that's something that I've been happy to pass on to some of the students that I have the pleasure of working with, to just say, look, I mean, if there's a straightforward way of saying it, then that should probably be the default setting.
Mm-hmm. That goes a little bit to sort of our next key question here about learning to write from just writing words to actually making sense. Would you say that accessibility or some sort of like democratic principle lies behind some of your writing, that you have the ambition that anyone who is interested enough to actually sit down and read can read your work and get something out of it?
I think that's becoming increasingly true. Now, there's certain pieces of writing where I would just say right off the bat, the number of people who will be interested in this particular article is really small, and I have no interest in increasing it, because there's so many technical terms that need to be used here, and to try to avoid them would actually almost be an insult to the academy, because I mean, there's a reason why we have terminology in place. And so sometimes those are insider pieces. But in general, with projects, at least with one of the projects I'm working on right now, which I think is somewhere on our list, I definitely want to make sure that people anybody gets what I'm talking about. Now, I still want to adhere to academic principles. I still want to footnote things. I still want to use sources in multiple languages and all that. But there are ways of doing that without obstructing accessibility. Because I think that when we have a topic that we think is important, we don't want to just write for our fellow folks in the academy. We want to write for a broader audience. And I've always thought, and actually my wife was my harshest critic, she loves the stories that I tell, and she says, maybe you really should write a piece of historical fiction one of these days, and that might just be therapeutic. So I do strive for maximum accessibility. I don't always succeed. maybe I rarely succeed.
Do you make it a major point in your classes that students should steer away from pretense?
Yes, because it actually, I think that the most writers who have a pretentious style, they do it. I think most of them don't do it intentionally. I think they have maybe somewhere internalized the urge that in order to be an academic, in order to be a scholar, you need to sound as sophisticated as possible, and I don't think that's true. I mean, you want to sound mature and you want to sound like you really have your ducks in a row. But if you're really trying to basically, when often the first word that comes to mind is the right word. And when you try to substitute something for it that you think just sounds more highbrow or whatever, it's an obstruction. And I do tell people that. And usually I only have to tell people once. And then they amend their evil ways. But sometimes I have to say, look, it's still very pretentious. And so, and sometimes you can give people, I mean, actually not sometimes, always you can tell, you can give clear examples and say, look, I mean, here is the word that you probably want to use here. I do make it a point in my classes to try to at least encourage getting rid of the pretense and just sounding clearer.
I have a similar problem with students, and the problem tends to get worse as they advance in their work often. I find graduate students more interested in sounding academic than often students do at the beginning of their careers, and I feel it's an insecurity or a sense that their status doesn't match their experience, and so it's a bit of a reflection of an imposter syndrome. I wonder whether you have ever faced some sort of doubt or criticism on account of you being a German-born professor teaching English, because I'm very aware of the fact that I'm wordsmithing on students' work. And they for them English is their mother tongue, and it's decidedly not for me. Have you ever encountered difficulty sort of coming across as the authority on that?
No, because and here's the reason why. I mean, English and American language and literature was one of my PhD fields. I mean, and so when somebody wants to lecture me on grammar or syntax or any of these things, I do raise my eyebrows, because I say, I actually spent many years training for this. And I think what finally broke any kind of hesitation as far as that is concerned is when I got a letter of recommendation from one of my British colleagues. And I wasn't even supposed to see the letter, but she sent it on my behalf to somebody, and he showed me the letter, and she wrote, his English is better than that of most native speakers in the English-speaking world. And I was like, okay, so it must be pretty good, So that doesn't mean I don't still have an accent. I still have an accent, and I'll never get rid of that accent. We know that. But when it comes to actually making sure that language is correct, that syntax is correct, that there is a sense of style, I don't really hesitate. Now, I still think, but I don't know whether that's true, that my style in German is more refined than my style in English. But I've now lived here for so long, and I've written so much in English and published so much in English that it may be evening out at some point. So nobody has ever come back to me and said, well, you are not a native speaker, and therefore how dare you correct my grammar or my because I would probably just laugh in their faces.
Yeah. Do you have a certain process by which you craft your sentences or paragraphs to make sure that they that they bring across what you mean to say?
Yeah, because the writing comes in my sort of like, I'm trying to say, are we anywhere in those 1 to 7 points that you have here? Or are we still in the introduction?
We are in point 2 now, learning to write, making sense.
Okay, good. Okay, so because then I did take some notes. I want to make sure that I actually say the things that that I think may be meaningful in this context. I am a believer in systematic research and writing. So I think that whenever I start a project, I start with this really painful tripartite statement, which is sort of like, I'm researching A because I want to find out B so I can tell others C, or I'm researching A because I want to know B so I can help others understand C. It's really difficult because sometimes we just embark on a project and the question is, why? You know, what am I actually trying to find out here? And then also this third part, what is the actual relevance of this research, which was a challenge for me early on in graduate school, because I had this professor when I was an exchange student at the University of North Carolina who said, okay, if there's no point to your research, if you can't walk into a mall when somebody asks you and say, here's why this should matter to you, you have actually given up your social relevance as a scholar. And I found that extremely irritating. But I thought, okay, so let's do this. Let's make sure that every time we embark on a project, we don't just know what we are researching, but we know what we're trying to find out, and we know how this would, on some level, benefit mankind. I often start by clarifying terminology because, and I circle back to that repeatedly. One of the projects I'm working on now deals with refugees, and when I talk to my modern history colleagues, the term refugee in the 20th century was very clearly defined by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and all that. So we have a very nice modern definition of what constitutes a refugee. But my period is about 800 years ago. And there was, while we had terms for refugee in Latin, in Old French, and all those languages, it did not mean the same thing because there were no international borders. There were no, you wouldn't leave a nation state when you were a refugee. So the terminology that is being used now, forcibly displaced persons, actually works much, much better. But it sounds so surgical, it sounds so sterile, that one of the first things I do in the project that I'm working on now is I always say, look, when you hear refugee, this is what you associate with it. When you basically go back 800 years, people were having some of the very similar experiences, and we do need to use the same term. We just need to explain what we mean by that. So I always start with very clearly defining my terminology. Once I have done that, I would probably say 90% of the entire process in systematic research. And systematic research to me means not just going systematically through the primary sources and the secondary sources, but taking my notes in a way right off the bat. It's very slow, that makes sure that I will always know what these notes mean. So when I take notes, I always make clear, is this a quote? Is this a paraphrase? Is this just a summary? I always add footnotes immediately to my notes. And then since we are all getting up there in age, losing our hair and all that, I have this firm belief that any brilliant thought that comes to my mind only comes once. And if I don't write it down, it'll be irretrievably lost. And so I immediately write down any thoughts that I have and I initial them. So if I were you, it would be a VJ. In my case, it's a JB. And I write them immediately behind each note that I'm taking so that I know these are the thoughts that I have. Sometimes then when I go back, I laugh at them because they are so naive or whatever. But what it also does is in the process of note-taking, I am processing the material. And so I'm not waiting with interpretation attempts until I've taken all my notes. I'm writing this down as I'm taking my notes from the material. And sometimes, when I feel like it, I write sentences that I will later adapt or adopt into the actual paper, but that's not necessarily always the case. And it's not until the very end, so usually really when 90% of the research work is done, that I start writing. And then what I do first is I read through all the notes and all my commentaries and everything that I've done. And then I close my computer and I take a walk or something like that, and then I try to remember what are the key things that percolate to the top, going back to that initial question. Basically, what am I actually researching? What am I trying to find out, and how would this benefit somebody? And what I found then is then I usually return to my office, and I have a whiteboard, a fairly big whiteboard, and then I try to just kind of jot down what the key things are that I remember, because those are usually the things that I have the strongest evidence for. And that means that a lot of the other stuff will just kind of sink to the bottom and will maybe not even get used in a paper. And then I start the actual crafting, and very often then that comes together pretty quickly, because I know what I have and I know what I can say based on the work that I have done. So really the writing happens really toward the very, very end, and then it happens fast. Now, it doesn't always work that way, but now probably really most of the time that's the process.
So there are two things that impress me here. The first is that you say you need to be able to sort of have the elevator pitch available, because otherwise you really are, you are at sea. And I would assume that you say it's not enough to say we need to research this because we don't know this yet.
No.
Right?
No.
So just because a story has not been told doesn't mean that it deserves telling.
Well, yes,
on its own,
no.
Right?
Yes and no, because there are a lot of stories out there that, because they have not been told, there's a reason why those stories have not been told, and that reason can often be so sinister that alone is a reason to tell the story. I mean, I know that in or I have a pretty good sense that in history we have neglected the people who are not prominent. We have neglected the people whose names we don't know, even though they do show up in the material. And so we as historians, I think we have this. I think it goes back to this fundamental American or Anglo-American misunderstanding of the Rankian idea of what eigentlich gewesen means, which has always been translated as things actually were, or as the past actually was. And the term that Ranke used, eigentlich, in the 19th century meant essentially. So if we want to get to the term of, if we want to get to the essence of the past, we need to make sure that the story of things past gets told in a comprehensive fashion. But again, when you take the third part of the elevator pitch, there are a lot of stories that have not been told, but there will be a lot of people most people will just not care, and I think we can waste our time as historians with projects where we just really we're never going to reach anybody with that. And so I don't think it's enough to, I agree, I don't think it's enough to say, well, just because the story hasn't been told, it now must be told, and I must be the one to tell it. Mm-hmm. But sometimes that's a possibility.
Now, you're very systematic in your research. Do you know why your subject or why your story matters at the beginning, or does this only evolve over time? Because in the way you laid it out, it almost sounded like you know exactly what you're going to do, and then you're going to go there and you find the evidence, and that answers the very question that you asked, and then you write it down. But it's not quite that neat, is it?
It's not. So with the big project that I'm working on now, which is essentially a history of refugees at the time of the Crusades, I know that there is a great need to tell that story because it really has not been told. I mean, there's a handful of articles that deals with very specific cases of people that we know by name who fled during a 200-year plus period in world history. But to me, it's kind of shocking that since the Crusades resulted in such mass displacement wherever they went, and not just one time, but recurrently in mass displacement, and the evidence is there, and we have, the chronicles talk about it, that nobody has ever bothered to really systematically go through that. To me, was like, it's, if nobody else is going to do this, I'm going to do this, and so I've been working on that. I'm in the process, actually this weekend, finishing my second article on that. And so I think that is a story, even just in light of all the stuff that's been going on in the past almost 2 decades now, is a story that really has to be told. And even now in this period of coronavirus, we can so quickly get so engrossed in our situation and all that, and not keep track of the fact that there are now over 70 million people on the planet that are forcibly displaced, and 20 to 30 million of them are actual refugees, which means they're no longer in their country. So I think with that project, to convince people that there is a relevance to that is fairly easy. Now there's some other, there's the other project that I'm working on, where it's sort of like, okay, most people will just roll their eyes, because years ago I found this manuscript in the French National Library that is a early 14th century legal text of which there's only one copy, and it is not the autograph, which means it is not the original that the author wrote. It is somebody who copied from the original, and the copier or the copyist did not fully understand what he was copying. So there are all sorts of errors built in, and it's a legal text, and it's and stretches of it are deadly dull. But the text has never been edited, it has never been published, and it is one of the few examples of somebody from the probably lower nobility who had writing abilities composing a legal treatise. And so there is some interest in it, but it's a small community of legal scholars that are going to care. And so there it is almost a little more, it's art for art's sake. It's, I can show that I found the text and it had been known, but nobody had really bothered, and I'm fighting my way through it. I'm going to try to make sense of it. But to say that is going to be something that makes a difference, I mean, on a great scale, not so much. I mean, that's just, it's going to make some people really happy, and it's going to make me really happy when it's done. But there's no big social relevance in that at all.
So I draw from this that those of us who sort of wonder what kind of writer or scholar should we be the ones that speak to urgent issues in the present with stories of the past, or should we be the ones who are engaging in a more refined conversation with a small scholarly community? We don't have to choose. We can do one on some occasions and the other on different occasions.
Yeah, I think that's really true. I also think that when we sometimes historians are told by non-historians that we are supposed to tell them, okay, so what are the lessons of the past? And I have a colleague at Oxford who resents that notion with every fiber of his being. He basically always says, look, I mean, to look to the past, to get lessons for the present is doing both the past and the present a great injustice. That's not to say we shouldn't connect the two in, for example, the way, I mean, every generation is going to restudy certain aspects that have already been studied before. But what I think is really interesting is that we have had so many great strides in the sciences and in the humanities of theories and others that have never been applied to things in the past. So it's almost like we're not looking how we in the present can benefit from lessons in the past. It's almost like we are looking for how can we take findings in the disciplines now and apply them to material in the past. And that can be useful both when we talk to a broad audience. When we look, for example, the new research on PTSD and things like that, how that can apply to things that happened thousands of years ago, even if we have the evidence. Or it can apply to something that is really minuscule. I think we just need to know our audience, just basically when we are devising a project, at some point, we have to decide who's this actually for, and I think that for example, when it comes to being a graduate student and you write a thesis or you write an exam, very often you write an exam and your primary reader will be an expert in the field, but your secondary reader might be completely in a different field. And so you need to have the ability to communicate things with some clarity. The same is true when you do grant writing. And we see this all the time. When we write a grant, they even write into the text, make sure that you actually write in a way that people outside your discipline can understand what you're writing about. Yeah. So I think that's a very important principle to keep in mind at all times.
So know your audience. And the other question I had, when you talk about refugees for your time period, I get more excited about medieval history than I possibly have ever been. And for me, as someone who studies, anything from sort of the Civil War to the present, looking around and seeing situations that are now and getting ideas for historical research, that's not all that strange. We are very, very openly, and I think we shouldn't be coy about it, very sort of clearly influenced by contemporary issues when we do historical research. But it never occurred to me that this could also be the case, say, for a medievalist. Is it the current situation in the United States? Is it the situation in Syria that inspired your interest in refugees in the Middle Ages?
No, it's older than that. It goes back to World War II, actually, and of course I wasn't alive during World War II, but it goes back to stories of my paternal grandmother, who had to flee from Eastern Prussia with 3 little children and a hand wagon in the final days of World War II. And she would tell us the stories. Basically, she came from a very affluent background, and they had multiple houses and servants and all that. And then the Russians came, and they had to evacuate. They had to leave. And she would always tell us these stories, and some of them were pretty harrowing. To leave a life of comfort and of everything you associate with that, with 4 little kids. I mean, I always forget about my little uncle. That she had to leave by herself. Literally, anything that mattered to her had to fit into this hand wagon where her little son was sitting in. And she would always tell us these stories with a smile on her face. And at some point, I said, "Grandma, these are not good stories. I mean, this is sad. This is dramatic and all of that." And she said, "But we all lived." She said, we are a family now. While her husband was killed in World War II, she said, "I came out of this with my 4 little kids, and my 4 kids lived to adulthood. They all, made their way in the world." And so for her, there was such an overwhelming sense of gratitude that yes, she had to find a new home, and it was not what she was used to, but she got away. And that story, somehow it was always in the back of my head. And when I was finished in the final stages of my PhD, which dealt with something completely differently, my advisor back in Germany, because he thought I was going to stay on and do one of those monstrous habilitation theses that Germans do, he said, "So what's your topic for your habilitation?" And I said, "Refugees in the Middle Ages." And he actually had tears in his eyes. He said, "There is no study on that at all." And I knew that, of course. I had kind of done my homework, and I thought, okay, so here we have 1,000 years of Eurasian history, more or less, and nobody has ever really bothered to look at refugees. And what I was interested in right off the bat were not, I mean, there are all these famous stories when a pope flees, or when a king flees, or a queen, or a count, or a duke, or a knight, or whatever. And we know their names, and we have quite a few details about their fates. But when we get to the sort of the things that I mentioned more in passing in the text, where we know that a city was under siege and the population had to evacuate, or and there are so many instances of that. And sometimes the people who write these texts don't even spend that much time on them. But we see very often the desperation of people trying to get into a secure place, and then they are some get away, some don't get away, and all that. And I thought, I want to tell the story of those whose names we don't know, because that is the vast majority of people throughout history. And so some of my colleagues, when they first heard about it, they said, "Well, but you are by training a prosopographer, and a prosopographer is somebody who studies people based on their names and their functions and all that." And they said, "Isn't that a complete 180 from what you're used to?" And I said, "Yes, it is a complete 180 from what I'm used to." But that to me makes it even more interesting.
It's funny that you mention your family background, because my maternal grandfather also came from an East Prussian family with real property, and there too were stories of fleeing ahead of the Red Army. And I recognize that there's a historical fiction piece out right now for young audiences. So for our students, but also for younger, by Ruta Sepete's Salt to the Sea, which tells a story of different refugees sort of moving across Poland and ending up some on the Gustloff ship that sank on the Baltic, and others making it in different ways.
If anybody wants to take a break from all the highbrow nonfiction reading that we do and wants to read a really good novel on the subject of refugees, it's by Christy Leftery, and it's called The Beekeeper of Aleppo.
Oh,
and
yes.
It's amazing. I mean, it's a book that I just read with a small group of students, and it's a stunning narrative. Christy Leftery herself was a refugee, not from Syria, but she worked with Syrian refugees, and I think it was published in 2016, and it was just republished in 2019, and it's such a harrowing story. And she asked this really fundamental question to me, that is, what do we see? And I think as historians, that is so important, because we can look at our material, we can look at what we're dealing with, and very often we are so conditioned by what we are supposed to see that we don't really see what is there, and that's that she said that was the motivating thing for her, that she wanted to answer the question with this book, what do I see, and I think that's wonderful, and so we have so many opportunities there.
Yeah, I think one of my graduate students in 571, Patrick, wasn't that you? Didn't you mention The Beekeeper of Aleppo on Tuesday? So to get back to a previous point, the methodologies, you say you focus, you do your research first, and take your notes, and you take your notes carefully. And I think we need to underline the importance of being humble about our ability to remember and place our writings and our notes and sort of make sense of them. So I think excessive caution and annotation is absolutely vital, so we don't mistake quotations for genius ideas that we once had. Do you consider yourself a follower or adherent to any particular methodology? Are you defining yourself as an empiricist Rankian, or an ardent admirer of postmodernism? Do you label yourself that way? Because often our students believe that they have to choose a methodology as the right one.
No, because I think that methodology for the scholar is like a tool belt for the carpenter. You basically carry a tool belt and you have all these different tools and you apply them as needed to actually work on your project. So I think that when it comes to reading primary sources, I probably am very much in a Rankian tradition. I read them very carefully. I spend an enormous amount of time on source criticism. So before I even read the source, I want to know all the externals. I want to know, how do we have this source? It's always so funny to me when people say, well, I have this ancient author who writes about the 1st century BC. And I'm like, well, how old is the oldest existing manuscript of that? And then we find that the oldest existing manuscript was written under the Carolingians in the 9th century. And I said, so how do you know that this is not a piece of creative writing? So I always want to make sure that whenever I deal with a source that I'm not already familiar with, that I spend an inordinate amount of time, some would say, on source criticism, trying to say, what are questions that I can reasonably ask this source, and what are questions that I really need to steer away from. By the same token, I was very fascinated by Heidenreic's meta history. This idea that when we write history, we are actually channeling ideology, and so I've always been have tried to be very aware of that, because years ago I told my students in a graded seminar that I think that that excessive sarcasm is really not a good thing, and they started laughing, and I said, why are you laughing? And then they said, because you are excessively sarcastic. And I said, well, so I was not aware of that, So I think we do need to realize at some point how we actually come across, because not everybody gets our sense of, certainly not everybody gets my twisted sense of German humor. And so I have to make sure that I'm very aware of that. Another thing that was very impacted by was, there's a German philosopher by the name of Hans Blumenthal, who wrote about a myth, basically the story, who wrote about basically mythopoetic discourse. And the idea is that any story we tell is actually, or could be, the retelling of an archetypal story that is already there. It's the same, and I see this again when I'm writing about refugees, that on some ways it is a collective retelling of the hero myth, that Joseph Campbell wrote about. And so I really use these things as I go along and say, okay, so where is there somebody who has written about this in a way that I could benefit from? And I encourage my students to do that. And when they ask a question of the sources, I say, look, try to see if somebody else has asked a similar question, not necessarily always even in the same context, but maybe something that is similar in an adjacent field with an adjacent subject matter. In history, it could sometimes be that somebody has asked that very same question in a different period, in a different region. So I really think that methodology is something much like, when I go into my barn and I pick out my power tools to work on a wood project, I choose the tools that I need. And so I'm not a follower, I'm not a disciple of a certain scholar. I try to apply them as needed.
I will clip this particular answer and share it with my 300A class, because we've had these conversations about methodologies, and I think this remains a source of intimidation for students for a long time, how to apply a methodology and be clear about it, and at the same time not fall into traps where you become, say, a disciple, a follower, and everything you see you wanna cast in the way that Michel Foucault would approve of, because all these thinkers at one point or another made their mistakes and made their vital contributions. I want to move to our point 4 here on working with editors, and how to accept and ask for the right kind of criticism. And last month with Stephen Neufeld, I shared my own experience as a writer for NDR, the German Northern Public Radio station, where I wrote a piece that the editor did not approve, and in that particular environment, he just crumpled the piece of paper into a ball and threw it at my head and said, "Try again." It was harsh criticism, very valid, but that's usually, of course, not how our editors respond to us. So how do we accept and how do we ask and receive the right kind of critiques on our writing?
I think that this is one of those things where we as Germans have one of the most difficult times when it comes to our students, because we are so used to receiving harsh criticism that we sometimes turn around and we dole out harsh criticism, not maybe realizing that they're not quite used to basically getting it so bluntly, and maybe not being aware that when somebody actually goes to the trouble of giving you detailed feedback, that is actually a compliment. So I remember when I was writing a chapter in my dissertation, and I thought, this is like the gold standard. This is the best chapter ever. And I had written 3 or 4 chapters, and my advisor and I met, and he basically worked his way through all the chapters. He started with the last one, and then and I thought the entire time he's saving the best for last. And then when he came to this chapter, he said that entire chapter needs to be trashed. And I was just like, my jaw dropped. And then he explained very calmly to me that I had basically strayed from the overall trajectory of my thesis, that I had opened myself up to a plethora of possible criticisms. And he said, this is something that is not necessary in your thesis. This is not something that basically propels this forward in any way. You basically try to dabble in a field that you lack the skills to dabble in at this point. And I accepted it. And so my takeaway from that was that the best editors are the ones who truly care about you and your work, and that don't hesitate to give it to you straight. Sort of along the lines of your "I love you, but," this, and those people are really rare. And not every editor can do everything. I have a friend in Germany who's a master grammarian, and when I write in German, which I'm not as used to now, especially with all the changes they've made to spelling and stuff in the last 20 years, I usually send it to him, and I brace myself when I get it back because he rips through it. I mean, it looks like I'm a first grader, and he has just edited my first essay. I have a colleague in the UK who's very widely read in our mutual fields, and her contextual knowledge is encyclopedic. And so whenever I have the time, and I try to make the time to send her something before I send it on, I wait for her feedback because it's really helpful. My wife is an excellent critic because she reads things extremely carefully, and she does not hold back. I mean, when something I write is dull, when I'm repeating it myself, she tells me, and she does not mince words, and she's not even German. So basically, when you're working with an editor, don't ask for praise. If you're hoping for praise, then you're probably working with the wrong editor. Ask for help. And if possible, ask different people for help. That's, I think, the most valuable thing. And I think when somebody really gives you criticism, and you are convinced that they have your best at heart, which I'm hoping is the case with all of us and all of our colleagues, is that when we give feedback, I can only encourage our students then to just take it and run with it. And if there's something you don't understand, just ask. I mean, ask back and say, all right, so you basically circled this and you said this is awkward, or this does not work, or there's a non sequitur here, this does not follow in the argument, to ask back. But I think the most important thing is when you work with editors, don't wait for praise. I asked my advisor, who was Swiss, back in the day, after he had once again just given me back all sorts of comments. I said, is there anything I do right? And his response was, if you didn't do most things right, I wouldn't be working with you. Which sounds again really harsh, but I thought, okay, so that's because he didn't have very many PhD students. He was very selective about his cohort, and so I think just brace yourself, and sometimes you can get really excited when somebody finds something where you've really messed up, where your argument is just is not coherent, or where you have maybe misread a source. I mean, which is horrible when it happens, but that's where you have editors that can basically come to the rescue. Yeah, so basically, brace yourself. Don't wait for praise.
I think an important point you make is that you need to have different people reading your work, and those you need someone who reads it as a non-academic, maybe someone who is competent and and reads as an educated person, but is not off the field. And then you need. I had a thesis committee of six faculty, and they all brought different strengths. My chair was a cheerleader. He just sort of motivated me and gave me sort of the boost that made me feel like I was not wasting my time. And there were others that took 2 months to return the chapter, but then had it heavily annotated. And one of them, I for the longest time didn't want to have on my committee, even though he was exactly working in my field. But he had so scared and intimidated me in my first seminar, in a reading seminar. It was a small graduate class of 2 students and 1 faculty. And I remembered the horrible feeling in my stomach I had every time in that class, because he was such a thoughtful person and made me feel like a dolt, that I didn't want to have on my committee. And eventually I decided to do it. And he asked later, why didn't you ask me right away? I said, I was scared of you. So it takes some courage to approach someone, and then also to withstand what you ultimately asked for. Now, when you work as an editor, what are the things that you notice most in other people's or in your students' writing, other than the pretense we already addressed at the beginning, that you try to rectify?
Yeah, the first one is that some people try to include everything they know. And research and writing is either evidence-driven or it's problem-driven. So you need to be clear, and you don't need to tell us everything you know when you are a writer. Don't muddle the waters. I mean, this is one of those things where I say, really, writing is on a need-to-know basis. So you basically don't include additional stuff. The second thing that a lot of people, and we see this often when we get papers back, we also see this in submissions to our journal, is that when the structure is unclear. And I think when I teach writing, I'm a big advocate of going to the 99-cent store, getting one of those whiteboards when they have it, and then just mapping out a structure before you write, because a structure must be clear. I mean, unless we're doing creative writing, unless we engage in poetry or something, when we are writing an academic piece, there needs to be clear structure. The third thing, and that's probably the one that aggravates me the most as an editor, is sloppy proofreading. I think there is no excuse for that, because I think that every piece before you turn it in should be proofread 3 times. It should be proofread for language, it should be proofread for content, and it should be proofread for format. And you can't do that at the same time. So fix the language first, and then read for content, make sure that everything actually follows, and then make sure that you actually follow Chicago style and all that. And then there are so many proofreading options now. I mean, the newest version of Microsoft Word, when you have that, where there's that little light bulb up top, you can type in there, read aloud, and then Microsoft Word will read your entire paper back to you. Yeah. And so you don't even have to read it yourself aloud. You can listen to somebody in a computer voice reading it, and when it's bad, it's gonna sound bad, And so so there's really, that's the third thing really. But when proofreading is sloppy, I tell my students always when I have a class that involves a draft and the final paper, I say, if you turn in a really polished draft, that to me is almost like you're putting out a challenge for me to find anything else wrong with your paper. If you give me a really sloppy draft, and I do not use the term rough draft. I don't want to read anybody's rough draft. I mean, basically, if it's not already at a point where you have really, it's sort of in the pre-final stage, then that I think we are wasting our time. So I think that I think we need to be very cognizant of that. When you turn something in that is near, at least in your opinion, near perfect, then your proofreader, your editor, will really be challenged to make sure that it's perfect when he or she returns it to you. I think that's kind of the just.
I want to ask, are you? What's your thought on chatty footnotes?
The older I get, the less I like them. But there are exceptions, and I use chatty footnotes very rarely. And actually, I wouldn't call them chatty footnotes, because I think the footnote, first of all, of course, is a gift that we as historians gave to the world. It can be used for 3 different things. It can be used for, first of all, it's used for documentation. That should easily be 90+% of the time, where we basically document our sources, we document our, basically, we make sure that we stand in the right context and we document our material. Occasionally, the footnote can be used to clarify something that if you clarified it in the text, it would become a distraction, but that can be dangerous, because then some people banish things into footnotes that really should be in the text. So that's really sometimes really difficult to gauge, when you say, okay, so maybe this clarification really should be woven into the text, because the reader needs to know, and almost every reader needs to know, so it doesn't belong in a footnote. Occasionally, and this happens really rarely, there is a tangent, and I think if it's well thought out, and then you can certainly do it in a footnote. Often it's more interesting to just add an appendix and basically say, okay, so there's a side thought that I want to develop, almost like as an additional contribution, but it really goes into the back of the paper. But usually chatty footnotes, I think, are a pain for an editor. They are a pain for the reader. They are a waste of space. So mostly no.
Because I found that a lot of times students, that later figure out that the paragraph they wrote doesn't really fit fit the topic of the essay, but they put the work into the paragraph, and they're not going to toss the paragraph because they wrote it. And if you wrote it, then somebody better read it. So they tuck it into the footnote. And I say to them, like, you need to, these are not, paragraphs are not your babies.
Yes.
They are paragraphs, so if they don't work for you, you kill them, which is not what you do with babies, of course. So don't get attached to your writing, and feel like everything you wrote at some point has to somehow appear in a paper. And we have to learn the sort of the painful process of cutting things, even if we slaved over the paragraph for a day. If in the end it doesn't do what you want it to do, then that was just a learning experience.
Yeah, and if it's really so hard to part with it, then save the entire file under a different name and archive it somewhere.
Right.
You know, if it's really painful to delete it, but ultimately it needs to be deleted for clarity.
Yeah. Now, you of course have a lot of experience working as an editor and teaching students how to write better, as sort of the person, I think, being in charge of the Willibethan. I'm not sure I want to call you editor, because of course you teach the students how to edit as well. What are the things that sort of you have learned about our students and their writing in your time with the Willibethan?
So one of the things is that, of course, there's editing and then there's editing. One of the things that I started doing when I started teaching history 406A is I said, you know, editing is, of course, the editing of scholarly work, but it's also the editing of scholarly material. And so I think that, and we try to do that as part of the class as well. And I think the students are doing an incredible job going to the archives, finding unpublished documents, and oral histories, and then transcribing them, and then writing commentary. In many ways, that is a really important part of learning how to edit, because when you carefully have to scrutinize a manuscript, reading it really, letter by letter, you have to annotate it, you have to clarify things. That is a really good training ground for historians. And then when it comes to the actual editing, I often find that I need to encourage them to really speak up and say, look, do you understand what the author is trying to say here? Because if you don't, then we can't publish it like that. We really need to say, and then often I find when I give them that extra encouragement, I'm unleashing the forces of heaven and hell, because then they go and they start putting their, Microsoft Word with that track changes function is sort of like unlimited. And sometimes, and we do, occasionally we tell an author when we have a paper that is kind of conditionally accepted, where we say, look, we see that there's something really valuable here, but brace yourself when you get it back that there may be entire sections where we have basically not just intruded, but we may have rewritten things, you know, basically said this. And we do say, you know, within reason, we might negotiate things, but part of the editing process is also that sometimes you just have to accept the editorial changes that are being made. And I find that the students actually really rise to all the challenges there. They learn the process of working with styles, the different layouting functions and all that, to use, to really use, not just to make sure that your Chicago style is correct, but that you use it to its full potential. And so I'm actually, I have to admit that I'm enjoying this class way more than I thought I would. And now editing, bringing the journal together is always really hard work. And so in contrast to how we did it in the past, where we had the class every semester, I'm only teaching it in the fall. And then I work with a group of editors in the spring to really pull everything together. And it's hard work, but it's very gratifying, especially now that we are publishing it digitally, and the visibility has increased so much, and we can include way more images in the editions and all that. It's become really kind of exciting. It's very much, I think it's a training class, you know, for editors.
So I think anyone here in the audience is maybe past the point of thinking about signing up for either a graduate internship with the Willibethan or taking the history and editing class. But I had to ask you because this is such a clear example of our department's commitment to students' good writing. Now, on point 7, waiting to write, procrastination and how to fight it, you come across now as so disciplined and structured and are so demonstrably productive that we can skip this for you, right?
No, well, you can, but that would be really disingenuous, because I often go into my classes and I tell my students that I'm the lifetime president of the World Association of Procrastinators. And since I'm the lifetime president, nobody else gets to have that title. I can be really, really bad, and it doesn't have to do with writer's block or something. It is sometimes I continue to do my research and then just push it out because I know that I often do my best work under immense pressure. But I'm trying to get better at that. So I do have some, I think there's some strategies how to fight it. And that is really to often start with any part of the project that you dread the most. Because I think in any project, we'll find either it's certain portion of material or something else that we need to wade through and we know we have to do it. Just move that to the very top of your agenda. And don't do it exclusively, but make sure that you start every day. The other thing that I've learned is working in 2-hour increments. I think that has been a game changer. I think Susan Jacobson told me that, is that when you are, if you want to be at your most productive, then about every 2 hours, you should actually shift gears and do something else. So I try to work in 2-hour increments. I am not a writer-rewriter, and I think that's really important for people who do procrastinate, and then they think they're going to have multiple opportunities to rewrite. Basically, once I write something, it is almost always a near final version. And so, and I do believe, and I think this is important for procrastinators too, you need to have a life-work balance. You need to I think there's a reason why there's a Sunday or any other day of the week that you basically say, I'm not going to work on that day. I'm just going to take a break, completely recharge, do something else, make sure that you get some kind of a physical balance, allow time to play, because otherwise procrastination can become a real disease. And I have had my share of horrible late-nighters and all-nighters, and I don't recommend it.
Yeah. Do you write on computer or on paper?
Oh, on computer.
Stephen Neufeld shared with us last month that he actually first writes on paper because he feels less inhibition writing things with a pen on paper than putting it on the screen. He's much more likely to hem and haw over choice of words when he has something on the screen than when he does it on paper.
I think that's really interesting.
I thought it was an interesting idea. I still am not there that I kind of want to make, because it seems much more cumbersome to me to write with pen and paper. But I found it a compelling idea. Now I have one more set of questions here. I think the writing tips, the ones that you want to put on a note and stick to your screen, I think you gave us a good number. Are there any that you think you haven't actually shared with us yet?
Yes, so, and I do this. I mean, this is no kidding. I mean, the paper that I'm working on right now, I have the title of the paper on a post-it note at the top of my screen, just to remind myself what I'm actually working on. And sometimes I do the same thing with the thesis statement, to just be very clear, this is what this is about. So don't get sidetracked, because it is, I think it's really important especially when we do work under pressure, under time pressure, and right now we don't just work under time pressure, we work under all sorts of other pressures, that we need to find ways to resist the temptation to do things that are just irrelevant. And so right now it's the title, because the title is, I have landed on a title for this particular article. And so just to remind myself, this is it, The same can be done with a thesis statement, but I try to not overload my screens with post-it notes, because then the distraction factor is back in.
But you make sure that your email program is not on while you're doing your work.
Oh, I'm worse than that. I mean, basically, when I'm really writing, when I'm in those stages, my cell phone is off. Any distraction is off. I have earplugs in. I have a noise-canceling headphones on. I'm completely in the zone. Basically, you would have to walk up behind me and push me to realize that you are in the room. Now my dog then comes in and he very gently first puts his paw on my leg, and then he puts his head on my leg, and then he climbs up on me, but otherwise I don't hear anything. I try to block out any and all distractions, and anybody who has not yet invested in noise canceling headphones, I strongly recommend that.
So so that's for full immersion into your work.
Yes.
Yeah. I think that's important, and I've seen my days wither away many times by checking my email every half hour and then prioritizing that over the work that I actually did in the end.
Well, we need to, especially right now, we need to resist the urge to be on email more or less 24/7, because while we want to be available for our students who are who actually in some way have less access to us because they don't see us in class, they don't see us in physical office hours, we are ultimately losing our productivity, and we are losing our ability to communicate clearly. We are losing our energy if we don't find some kind of a balance between sort of our own chattiness and willingness to help and our own productivity. And I feel really strongly that you can only teach writing well if you write yourself. You cannot really relate to the struggles of other writers if you're not sort of in the daily battle yourself.
Yeah. That, of course, also speaks to the ability of students to critique and read other scholars' work. And I've often been surprised of how merciless graduate students and history majors can be in the way that they assess the work of scholars, and how readily they call works failed or flawed, when there is very little appreciation for how difficult it is to put forth a coherent, sustained, evidence-based argument of any length.
This is something we actually address in the editing class, because I also make all graduate students in that class write 2 reviews, and all undergrads write 1 review, and I more or less let them pick what they write the review about. It has to be a recent work, and it doesn't just have to be a book. It can be a film, can be a documentary, can be a game for all I care. And then I tell them, because we intend to publish those reviews usually, I say, you want to make sure that you write the review in a critical way, but also in a way that if somebody wrote about your work that way, you would still be able to show your face, and so. Yeah. And plus, I always say that, look, until you have yourself written a major monograph on something, to rip into somebody else who has done so is really kind of inappropriate, So just kind of, and also don't write about somebody else in a way that you would not want to be written about. Yeah. I think that's sort of one of those golden rules in academia. Now, some scholars ignore that. Certainly, some of our students sometimes ignore that, and I think we should all be. You can be critical of somebody's approach without being hurtful, without being mean, so.
I have told my students the golden rule is you need to be able to present that critique to the writer face to face.
That's great, yeah.
And if you would not want to do that, then you need to change your approach.
Right.
Yeah. Joe, this has been a fantastic conversation, and so far we've had, I would say, a pretty good audience, but we haven't given anyone a chance to ask questions. So I would now turn to those of you who've been listening, and please ask questions. You can ask about Professor Burgtorf's work. You can also ask about your own writing troubles or reading troubles. So any questions you have that relate to our conversation here in any way is welcome. So I'm going to monitor the chat room, and you are also welcome to unmute yourself and speak your question. Not everybody at the same time. I know it's always a little difficult on these Zoom meetings because you don't know whether the very second you open your mic and start speaking, whether you're going to be barging into someone else's sentence. If you have no questions and just fully enjoyed the conversation, then you can also share that with me. Clay wants to know, what are you listening to when you write? Do you just keep silence on your noise cancelling headphones, or do you actually have music on?
Yeah, so when I'm writing, it's dead silence. Sometimes there are certain parts of the research process where music is good, and then it's usually non-vocal music, so it has to be instrumental, and it's often Baroque, because Baroque music is the least distracting form of music there is, because even most Baroque music doesn't have very clear melody lines, and so it's almost like your brain is stimulated, but it doesn't have to process a whole lot. So, but usually when I'm in the actual writing process, it has to be really, really dead silent.
Yeah, I've had this, that I try to listen to music, and it would actually still distract me. So it has to be music that you really kind of can eventually forget about. Are there any other questions, comments?
I had a question.
Yes, Miles.
Dr. Burgtorf, you characterized your process as, I believe, 90% research and spending time with the sources before you really started the writing itself. Have you ever gotten to that point where you're about to start and realize that the title that you put on your screen is the wrong one, and the tangent is more important or more interesting than your starting topic or your starting idea?
Not to the degree that that the tangent was more interesting, but I've certainly changed the titles, where I found, because as I said, I put a title on my screen when I think I have really landed on this title, but then when I'm done with all the note taking, I shut everything down, I take my walk, I come back, I write something on a whiteboard, I try to draft the paper, sort of like do a storyline, do a storyboard for the paper. And then when I look at it and see, well, that title really doesn't work, then I dump the title. That's not really a problem. I think it has never it certainly has never been the case that it was a complete change, because I think that's something I would have recognized way earlier in the process. So in the research process, there's always the possibility that once you really immerse yourself in the sources, there's this beautiful quote that I mentioned in all my writing classes, that the sources of old, like the children of old, they don't speak until they're spoken to, and they don't talk to strangers. So the idea is that you really need to know your material before you know what it's going to say. And then sometimes there can be a surprise. And if you get that surprise, then you adjust your title. In the project that I'm trying to finish this weekend, I just found that I needed to rearrange the structure pretty fundamentally. But it was early enough that I had started the writing, and I thought, if I address this now, I'm going to either have to severely repeat myself later on, or I'm actually stealing my own thunder way too early in the paper. So, but I'm a big believer in basically waiting until the research is really complete, because I think my horror scenario is always starting to write and then finding that I need to go back and look up stuff. And I don't want to do that. Basically, once I'm in the writing zone, I want to stay in that zone. And I only want to have to look up maybe really minute little things that I can Google really quickly, or that I can pull any of the big encyclopedias that are around me to just make sure that I'm solid on something. But I don't want to interrupt, if that makes any sense.
I do want to point out that this is also sort of a matter of experience. So getting to the point where you are not a stranger to your materials, and so they speak to you. That doesn't happen, say, to a graduate student in the beginning of the project. So it may take longer to get to that point. And if you find yourself putting a title on your paper and then writing and turns out that you were wrong, then it shows, and that's a learning process, that you hadn't done enough research yet.
It is also, though, when you think about it, there are so many atrocious titles out there, and you know,
Yeah.
I have at least one title of an article that the story is too long, so I will skip it this time. Where even in retrospect, it has caused confusion and has caused laughter and chuckles and all these things. So I think it's really important that we make sure the title is the greeting card of an article or of a paper or of a thesis or something. We do want to agonize over that. We want to make sure that it's actually really good.
Yeah.
And so I think that there is, in the Romans used to call it the horror vacui, the fear of the void. And so we need to make sure that we have something there. That often it's whether we write on paper or on a screen, that we basically say, okay, so here is what's going to be at the very top, because then we have to look at it every single time, and we have to look at it until we like it, you know. And so and just routine enough is not going to do it. I mean, I can look at a title that I don't like, you know, 100 times, and I still don't like it, you know. So, but I do believe that certainly, you know, you may revise things. One of the things that I always say in a title, you want to make sure that as historians, we want to have the what, the when, and the where in a title, but we also want to give the audience a hint of the trajectory. So that doesn't mean that the title is already giving away our thesis, but we want to communicate what the trajectory is probably the best word, that it's already in there. And if we find in the research process that trajectory changes, the title changes inevitably.
Yeah. Two more questions. First comes Patrick.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Cool. At what point do you feel that you've done enough research? Because I feel like when I'm conducting a lot of research, I feel like it just keeps going and going and going. I keep coming up with more questions. So, yeah.
Yeah, so great question, Patrick. So when that probably goes back to something I said at the very beginning. The question that we ask in our research needs to be clear. At least the initial research question needs to be so clear that we can resist that temptation to go into all sorts of side avenues. Now that doesn't mean that. I mean, we have so much more access to material these days than we had when I was a student. I mean, I remember that I did one paper in graduate school where I had 100 different titles in my bibliography, and everybody was in awe because I had to do so much interlibrary loan, and for every interlibrary loan you had to write a postcard, you had to put a stamp on it and all that, and it took forever. But I had the time, and so I did it, and it was very thorough. The paper actually years later got published, I mean, in a tier 1 journal, because I rewrote it and I did some more research on it. So the research was very thorough. But right now, what I find is that with all the access to databases, to ebooks and all that is out there, the bibliographies that I get are actually becoming shorter and shorter. And there's something wrong with that, because we have to keep in mind that we actually now have access to a much wider range of things. Now the trick is to basically draw very clear lines and basically say, all right, so when I'm pursuing a certain question, what is the material I need to really look at in order to ask that question meaningfully? And then what do I need to look at to embed this properly in the scholarship is out there? And there are certain tricks with regard to that. I mean, you basically, if there are encyclopedia articles that have been done, they would cite the most important works at the end. That means those are works that you cannot possibly avoid. You have to look at them. One of the most underutilized databases that we have full text access to is dissertations and theses.
Yes.
Because you will find, I mean, just sometimes it's mind-boggling how many dissertations and theses you can find that in some way are tangentially related. But they are full text searchable, which means you really use them. You don't read them. And
Right.
so I find myself often saying, okay, so what is the material that I really need to read slowly, very carefully? And those are my primary sources. The vast number of scholarly works that serve as something that I need to interact with, I can read in a more cursory fashion. And I do make sure that I don't miss something. So I usually about a week before I finish my research, I go back into all the databases and see if something else has popped up, so that I'm not overlooking the most recent work that has just come out. But at some point you have to draw the line. And I think that it's important to do thorough bibliographical research early on, to make sure that you don't do bibliographical research as you go along. So that's why I call it systematic research. I front load my work with doing my bibliographical research systematically up front, so that I can reduce the number of surprises that I have.
I think that underlines that you need to make deliberate decisions in your research process, where you say, okay, this is what I do, and here I stop. And you make this deliberately, not intuitively, not because somehow you run out of time, but because it's part of your plan. And the other thing that I heard here, and I think that's really useful, is some works you use, you don't read. And with full text searches, that's absolutely good advice that can save you time. We have one time for
you have to be careful.
Right.
Be careful with full text searches, because sometimes you might land on something, you say, "Oh, this is a really cool sentence," and you're not really paying attention, and you don't realize that the author is actually quoting somebody else, and then later refuting that author.
Yes.
So I mean, using but with care.
Yes.
So,
and word searches aren't always foolproof. If you search in a PDF, for example, and you're looking for an expression, and the expression happens over a line break, PDF will not recognize it, and then all of a sudden you think, weird, I don't even talk about it, but they do. So yes, that's to be done with some caution. We have time for one more question from Miguel.
Hi. I'm familiar with a, not so great paper structure for for an English 101 course, or even for a History 490T course. I'm used to my own writing, so I can't really see, when I'm having some adversary moments. But for graduate standards, or for Willoughbythan admissions, can you, Dr. Burgtorf, give us like an example or like an element of what is a not so presentable structure that is like the baseline? It's not reaching the baseline yet.
I'd rather talk about how it should be done rather than how it should not be done, because that may be answering the question more precisely. I think it's important, first of all, to say, am I writing a research article or am I writing an essay? Because an essay is different. An essay is more leaning toward an opinion piece, maybe more developing an idea about something. And the standards of documentation are different. That doesn't mean that one should say, okay, so my paper doesn't really reach the standards of a research article, so I'm just going to call it an essay and then I'm going to get away with it. I think that when it comes to a research article that is presentable, that is actually good, you still have to hit on certain cylinders. You have to basically make sure that in the introduction of your article, you very clearly delineate what the topic is, what the focus is, then what is the material that this research is based on. So you have to both typologize, namely say, what types of sources am I using? That's source criticism, and you actually have to give some examples. And then you have to talk about briefly, at least, it doesn't have to be a lengthy historiographical review, but you need to embed your own work against other works. And that's not confrontational, but saying, okay, so if nobody else has ever done this work, who maybe in adjacent fields has done similar work? What are the benchmarks? What are the parameters? Then at some point early on in the introduction, you need to state your thesis and you need to tell us how you're going to proceed. And then in the actual parts, in the main parts of your article or in your thesis, you need to say, all right, so you need to approach it systematically, that each part contributes to basically undergirding, supporting your thesis. When you bring in the evidence needs to be contextualized. Nothing speaks for itself. Sometimes people would just throw out a major quote and they say, okay, so that speaks for itself. Nothing speaks for itself. No image speaks for itself. We speak for the sources. So you have to make sure that you introduce your source, that you present your source then you discuss your source in the context of other scholarly work, and then you give us your own finding. We do want to hear your own voice in the article, so we don't want to just see something where you are basically rehashing or regurgitating what somebody else has already done. We want to hear your own take on things. And then in the conclusion, I guess usually when conclusions are written at 2 a.m. in the morning, you can tell that a lot of people start waxing poetically, and they find that their papers have implications for world history and the fate of the planet and all that. Basically, then wake up in the morning, delete that, and rewrite it. I think that you just have to make sure that you hit on those things, document it carefully, make sure that the structure is clear. But I mean, as Miguel, you are an author that has been published in the Wellebethan. You currently have a paper that the editors have on their desk, so that means that that you must be doing something right.
Okay,
Yes,
that was wonderful advice. And the number of good one-liners here on how to do good work. I have to re-listen to this and write them all down. Thank you, Joe, Professor Burgtorf, for taking the time, and for all of those of you who listened. I really appreciated you being here. I know there's a lot of other things that you have to tend to, so it's all the more valuable. We are recording this, of course, for people to listen to at another time. We will have another one of these events in May, and who knows, maybe for the fun of it, I will continue it through the summer. I wish you a good weekend, and hope that this was helpful. And now we are signing off. Take care, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you.